When a Blue Origin rocket exploded back in May, it registered on seismic instruments at magnitude 2.5. On July 16th, something off the coast of Florida registered at magnitude 3.9, louder than a rocket blowing up, and it did it underwater on purpose. To everyone refreshing the earthquake map, it looked like the ground had done something impossible. A violent event at zero depth, off a coastline with no faults, tagged with two cold words, experimental explosion, and no explanation at all. It was not an earthquake. What it was a deliberate detonation of tens of thousands of pounds of explosive in the open Atlantic. And the strangest part is not that it happened once. It is that it has happened at least 9 times in the same patch of sea, and we logged every single one of them in public. Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The alert that should not exist. At 4 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, Eastern Time on July 16th, 2026, the ground off the coast of Florida did something that, on paper, should not have been possible. A magnitude 3.9 event appeared on the United States Geological Survey's public map. It sat out in the open Atlantic, about 91 miles east-northeast of Ponce Inlet. And the moment anyone who knew how to read that map looked at it, a small alarm went off in the back of their mind because almost everything about it was wrong. Start with the number itself. Magnitude 3.9 is not a large earthquake. If it happened under California, it would be a shrug, a rattle of the windows, a few dozen people posting that they felt something. But this did not happen under California. It happened off the coast of Florida, and Florida does not do this. Florida sits in the flat, quiet middle of a tectonic plate, hundreds of miles from the nearest active boundary. It is one of the most seismically boring places in the entire country. The kind of stress that builds up along the edges of continents, the kind that snaps and throws out a magnitude 3.9, simply is not stored in the crust off Daytona Beach. So a real earthquake of that size right there would already be a strange thing. Then look at the depth. The USGS listed it at 0.0 kilometers. 0, the surface. Earthquakes do not happen at the surface. Real earthquakes nucleate down inside the crust, usually somewhere between a few kilometers and a few tens of kilometers deep, where rock is under enough pressure and heat to lock up and then suddenly slip. An event pinned at 0 depth is telling you, in the flat language of a database field, that whatever released this energy did not come from down in the earth. It came from right at the top where the water meets the seabed, or from the water itself. And then there was the label. Where that entry on the map should have said the word earthquake, it said something else. It said in plain text, experimental explosion. That is the moment the story really begins, because that phrase did something very specific to everyone who saw it. It is a real category the USGS uses. It is not a mistake and not a cover word invented for this one event. But it is also a phrase that most people have never seen attached to a dot on the earthquake map, and it lands in the mind like a locked door. An experimental explosion off the coast of Florida, strong enough to shake the seafloor like a magnitude 3.9 earthquake. And on the alert itself, in the first hours, there was no explanation attached, no cause, no name, just the reading, the label, and the silence around it. So let me tell you the first honest thing, the thing that takes the raw panic off the table, and then let me show you why the real story only gets stranger from there. This was not an earthquake. The instruments are certain of that. It was an explosion, a deliberate one, a controlled detonation of an almost unbelievable quantity of high explosive out in the Atlantic. That is the partial answer, and I am giving it to you up front because I'm not in the business of stringing you along with a mystery I already know the shape of. The dot on the map was a bomb going off in the sea, on purpose. But that answer, the one that should close the case, is actually the trapdoor. Because once you know it was a deliberate explosion, the questions do not shrink. They multiply. Who sets off something the size of a small earthquake in the ocean off a populated American coastline? Why there? Why that day? Why does the public agency that watches for earthquakes log it in the open for anyone to see, but attach no explanation to it? And here is the one that took me from curious to genuinely unsettled. This was not the first time. It was not the second or the third. According to the Geological Survey's own records, this was the 9th time since 2016 that the ocean in this exact region has been logged as an experimental explosion. 9 times, in the same stretch of sea in 1 decade. And most people watching that map had no idea it had ever happened even once. Sit with that for a second, because it reframes everything. We are not looking at a freak event. We are looking at the 9th entry in a ledger that has been quietly filling up for 10 years, written in the language of earthquakes, on a public feed, under a label engineered to sound clinical instead of alarming. The thumbnail on this video says 3 words, and I chose them carefully. Something is wrong. But by the end of this, I want to convince you that the thing that is wrong is not what your gut first reaches for. It is not a secret weapon. It is not a hidden natural catastrophe clawing its way up from under the Atlantic. It is something quieter, and in a way that I will try to earn over the next couple of hours, something that should bother you more. Let me set the scene the way it actually unfolded, because the way people found out matters. Nobody in an office called a press conference. There was no emergency broadcast. What happened is that the event posted automatically to the USGS feed, the same feed that fires off a notification to phones and apps the moment any qualifying event is detected anywhere on Earth. People who follow earthquakes, hobbyists, monitors, the quietly obsessed, saw a 3.9 pop up off Florida, and they did what anyone would do. They tapped it, and instead of the familiar word earthquake, they got experimental explosion, a 0-kilometer depth, and a location in open water with no city, no fault, no nothing near it. Within minutes it was screenshotted and thrown onto social media, and the screenshot spread faster than any explanation could, precisely because it looked like a puzzle with a piece missing. The comparison started almost immediately, and one of them is worth holding on to because it gives you a sense of scale. Back on May 28th of this same year, a Blue Origin New Glenn rocket suffered an accidental explosion. That blast, an enormous rocket detonating, registered on seismic instruments at about magnitude 2.5. Now magnitude is a strange compressed scale, and I will get into why in a moment, but hold those 2 numbers side by side. A rocket blowing up, 2.5, this thing off Florida, 3.9. On the scale seismologists use, that is not a small gap. That is the difference between a loud event and a genuinely violent one. Whatever went off in the water off Florida shook the seafloor harder than a rocket exploding on the pad, and it did it on purpose, on a schedule, for the 9th time in 10 years. Here is what I find almost poetic about the whole thing, in a dark way. The United States Geological Survey is one of the most trusted scientific institutions in the country. When it labels something an experimental explosion, it is not being coy. It is being precise. Its analysts looked at the seismic signature of this event, ran it through the same discrimination methods they used to tell a rock fall from a quake, from a mine blast, from a nuclear test, and concluded correctly that this was a large deliberate explosion. The label is the truth, but the truth, delivered without context to a public that has never been taught what experimental explosion means, functions exactly like a secret. The honesty of the agency and the alarm of the public are, in this case, the same fact wearing 2 faces. So over the next stretch of this, we are going to take this apart layer by layer, the way it deserves. We are going to look at how you can even tell, from squiggles on a seismograph hundreds of miles away, that something was an explosion and not an earthquake, because that science is genuinely remarkable, and it is the whole reason we know what we know. We are going to find out what actually goes off in that water, and I promise you the real number is bigger than you are imagining right now. We are going to trace the other 8 entries in that ledger, back through 2021 and 2016, and we are going to find a coincidence sitting in the dates that looks, at first, like destiny. And then we're going to follow this down into the part almost nobody talks about, the part that lives not in the seismic record but in the water itself, among the animals that were already there when the charge went off. But it starts with a single, deceptively simple question, the one that separates a scared guess from actual knowledge. How do you look at a magnitude 3.9 off the coast of Florida and know, with confidence, from hundreds of miles away, that no fault moved at all? Part 2. How to tell an explosion from an earthquake. Imagine you're sitting in a dark room and you cannot see outside, but you have a set of extraordinarily sensitive microphones planted in the walls. Someone in another building, hundreds of miles away, either drops a bowling ball on the floor or claps their hands once very loudly. You never see it happen. All you get is the pattern of vibration that arrives through the walls, and your job is to tell me, with confidence, which one it was. That is, more or less, the problem a seismologist solves every single day, and the fact that they can solve it is the reason we can say, flatly, that nothing off Florida cracked or slipped or moved in any tectonic sense at all. The trick is that an earthquake and an explosion shake the ground in fundamentally different ways, because they are fundamentally different events. An earthquake is a shear event. It is rock sliding past rock along a fault, a tearing motion side to side. An explosion is the opposite geometry. It is a sudden push outward in every direction at once, a sphere of pressure expanding from a single point. Those two motions leave different fingerprints in the waves they send through the earth, and seismologists have spent more than a century learning to read them. The first and biggest clue is in the two main kinds of waves every seismic event produces. There are P waves, the fast ones, which are compression waves, the same kind of push-pull motion as sound travelling through air, and there are S waves, the slower ones, which are shear waves, a side-to-side shimmy that can only travel through solid material. An earthquake, because it is a shearing, sliding motion, pumps a lot of energy into those S waves. An explosion, because it is a pure outward push, pours most of its energy into the P waves and produces comparatively weak S waves. So when an event comes in with big dominant compression waves and a strangely quiet shear component, that lopsided ratio is one of the loudest possible hints that you're not looking at a fault. You're looking at a bang. The second clue is the one already sitting in plain sight on the alert: depth. I told you the event was logged at 0.0 kilometers, and I want to be honest about what that number really means, because it is a little more subtle than it looks. It is not that instruments measured the explosion sitting exactly at sea level with perfect precision. It is that, for a shallow surface source like this, the networks cannot resolve a meaningful depth at all, and so the value defaults to 0. The same thing happens with quarry blasts on land. The system essentially says, this thing is at the surface, I cannot give it a depth in the crust, so it is 0. And a source at the surface, by definition, is not a tectonic earthquake, because tectonic earthquakes live down in the rock, not on top of it. There is a third method, newer and cleverer, and I love it because it feels like a magic trick. It turns out you can measure the size of a seismic event in more than one way. You can measure it from the sharp, early part of the signal, and you can measure it from the long, ringing tail, the coda. For a natural earthquake, those two different measurements line up in a predictable way. For a shallow man-made explosion, they come apart by a characteristic amount. So by comparing an event's magnitude measured one way against its magnitude measured another way, an analyst can flag, almost automatically, whether they are looking at nature or at chemistry. It is like being able to tell a real signature from a forgery, not by the shape of the letters, but by the pressure of the pen. Now, I will give you the honest complication, because intellectual honesty is the whole point of this channel, and I am not going to pretend the science is cleaner than it is. That P-wave to S-wave method, the classic one, gets less reliable for smaller events, roughly magnitude 3 and below. And this event sat right around there, at 3.9. So discriminating these mid-sized blasts is not trivial. It takes the combination, the wave ratios, the depth, the magnitude comparison, the raw shape of the waveform all cross-checked together. But here is the thing that makes this particular case airtight, the piece that removes any lingering doubt. The analysts did not have to rely on the seismic signature alone. They had context. They knew that this exact patch of ocean has produced this exact kind of signal before, again and again, and they knew who tends to produce it. The waveform said, explosion. The history said the same thing, and the two agreed. There is an even deeper layer to the discrimination, and it is worth a moment because it is the mathematical heart of the whole thing. Seismologists can reconstruct what they call the source mechanism of an event, a compact description of the motion that generated the waves. For an earthquake, that description is dominated by what is called a double couple, the mathematical signature of shearing, of two blocks of rock sliding past one another. For an explosion, the description contains something an earthquake essentially never has, a large isotropic component, a term that just means the source expanded outward equally in all directions, a pure change in volume, a sphere of pressure. A fault cannot do that. Rock sliding sideways does not suddenly grow in volume. So when the reconstructed source of an event carries that big, outward-pushing, all-directions term, it is a fingerprint no earthquake can forge. The The math itself convicts the blast. This is not some obscure academic exercise either. It is the exact science that underpins the monitoring of nuclear weapons tests around the world, a discipline governments have poured resources into for more than half a century, precisely because the stakes of getting it wrong are civilizational. Every single day, analysts somewhere are looking at seismic events and asking the same question the Florida event posed in miniature. Was that the Earth, or was that a bomb? Mislabel a nuclear test as an earthquake and you miss a treaty violation. Mislabel an earthquake as a test and you risk an international crisis over nothing at all. So the tools for telling blasts from quakes have been honed to a razor's edge, and quarry explosions, mine collapses, and yes, Navy shock trials are the everyday practice material on which those tools stay sharp. Which is why, when the Geological Survey attached the words experimental explosion to that dot off Florida, it was not a guess, and it was not a placeholder. It was the output of a mature, tested, deadly serious science that has been distinguishing human blasts from natural quakes for generations. The label carried the full weight of that discipline behind it. The analysts were as certain that this was an explosion as they are certain, on any given day, that a real earthquake in Chile or Japan is an earthquake. The confidence was total. The only thing missing from the public alert was not certainty about what kind of event it was. It was the second half of the sentence, the part that says which explosion, and why. Put all of that together and you arrive at a conclusion that is both reassuring and, if you really think about it, a little chilling. The reassuring half is that the Earth did not do this. There is no hidden fault waking up off Florida, no new seismic threat to the coastline, no natural process anyone failed to warn you about. The crust out there is exactly as quiet as it has always been. The chilling half is what it means that the signal was so clearly artificial. Something human made this. Something human deposited enough energy into the Atlantic in a single instant to ring the seafloor like a struck bell and light up seismometers across the eastern United States. And it did so cleanly enough, precisely enough, that the machines could tell at a glance it was not nature. Because that is the strange inversion at the heart of the seismology here. Normally, when we point these instruments at the Earth, we are trying to catch nature in the act, to feel the planet move so we can understand it, and, when we can, warn people. The whole global seismic network exists as a kind of planetary nervous system, a way of feeling for the tremors that matter, and on July 16th, that nervous system did its job perfectly. It felt something. It flinched. It fired a notification to phones around the country, but the thing it felt was not the planet at all, it was us. We tripped our own alarm. We built a system to listen for the Earth's violence, and then we produced violence of our own, in the Earth's own medium, large enough to fool the surface of that system for an afternoon. And the people watching the feed, the ones who tapped that dot and saw experimental explosion and felt their stomach drop, they were not being paranoid or foolish. They were responding correctly to a genuinely alarming signal. Their instinct that something was wrong was accurate. They just did not yet have the missing piece, the one that turns a mysterious explosion into a known quantity. And that piece is a number. A specific, staggering, almost cartoonish number that tells you exactly how much force it takes to make the ocean shake like a magnitude 3.9. So let me give it to you, and let me tell you what it is attached to. Because once you know how many pounds of explosive went into the water off Florida that afternoon, and once you know what those pounds were arranged around, this stops being a story about seismographs and starts being a story about something enormous, grey, and floating, with a crew standing on its deck bracing for the shock. Part 3, 40,000 pounds. 40,000 pounds. That is the number, and I want to let it land before I wrap any explanation around it. In the shock trial that this July event most closely resembles, the one conducted back in 2021, the United States Navy detonated on the order of 40,000 pounds of high explosive in the water. 40,000 pounds is roughly 18 metric tons. It is the weight of a loaded city bus, converted entirely into explosive and set off in a single flash beneath the surface of the Atlantic. That is what it takes to make the seafloor shake like a magnitude 3.9 earthquake. And the Navy did not do it by accident. It did it next to one of its own ships deliberately, with the crew aboard. This is a thing called a full ship shock trial, and once you understand what it is for, the whole event stops looking like a mystery and starts looking like exactly what it is, a graduation exam for a warship. When the Navy builds a new class of vessel, an aircraft carrier, a destroyer, a combat ship, it is not enough to know that the ship floats and steers and fires its weapons in calm conditions. The Navy needs to know what happens to that ship in combat when a mine goes off nearby or a torpedo detonates in the water close to the hull and the entire vessel is hit with a sudden brutal shock that travels up through the water and through the steel. Will the engines keep running? Will the radar stay aligned? Will the pipes hold, the electronics survive, the crew stay on their feet? You cannot answer that from a computer model alone. At some point, the Navy insists on finding out for real, so they take the brand new ship out to sea, they put the actual crew aboard, and they set off a massive charge in the water a controlled distance away. Not close enough to sink it, close enough to slam it. They do this in a series, moving the charge progressively closer with each blast, so the ship experiences a rising ladder of shock, and engineers measure everything, every vibration, every system, every failure. It is, in a strange way, an act of enormous confidence. You're trusting that the ship you built is good enough to survive being bombed on purpose, with your own sailors standing on the deck. And the reason the whole thing shows up on earthquake maps is simply that the ocean is a superb conductor of that energy. Set off 18 tons of explosive underwater, and the shock does not stay local. It couples into the seabed and radiates outward for hundreds of miles as a seismic wave. This is also where that rocket comparison from earlier pays off, and where you get a real feel for why water changes everything. Remember the New Glenn rocket that blew up back in May and registered about magnitude 2.5? A rocket is an enormous amount of energy, but it explodes in air, up on a launch pad, and air is a terrible medium for transmitting a shock into the ground. Most of that energy blows outward into the atmosphere and is wasted seismically speaking. Now take a charge and put it underwater. Water is nearly incompressible. It does not absorb the punch and let it dissipate the way air does. It transmits it, hard, directly into the seafloor. So a blast in the water can shake the earth more efficiently than a larger blast in the air. That is why 40,000 pounds under the Atlantic reads as a 3.9, louder on the seismographs than a rocket detonating on the surface. The medium is doing the amplifying. Consider what is actually being tested because it makes the violence make sense. A modern warship is not a simple hull. It is a dense three-dimensional city of interdependent systems, thousands of them, stacked and interwoven through hundreds of compartments. There is the propulsion plant that drives it, the electrical grid that powers it, the radar and combat systems that let it see and fight, the pumps and valves and pipes that move water and fuel and air, the mountings that hold delicate electronics in place, and the human beings who operate all of it. In the sudden, brutal jolt of a nearby underwater explosion, any one of those systems can fail in ways no calm water sea trial would ever reveal. A weld can crack, a circuit board can shake loose, a pump can seize, a pipe can rupture, and in combat a single one of those failures at the wrong moment can be the difference between a ship that fights on and a ship that dies. The shock trial exists to find those weaknesses on a test range, in daylight, with engineers watching, rather than in the dark of a real battle. That is why the charge is walked in progressively. A shock trial series does not open with the biggest, closest blast. It begins farther out, with the ship absorbing a milder shock, and then, after inspection, the next charge is set off closer, and the next closer still, each one delivering a stronger jolt than the last. The ship climbs a ladder of violence, rung by rung, and at every rung an army of sensors records how it and its systems respond. This is the reason these trials come in a series of 3, rather than as a single event, and it is the reason the ocean off Florida does not shake just once during a campaign but several times over the course of weeks. And the ship at the center of the 2021 trial gives you a sense of the stakes. The Gerald R. Ford is not just any vessel. It is the lead ship of an entirely new class of aircraft carrier, packed with first-of-their-kind technologies, an electromagnetic system for launching aircraft in place of the old steam catapults, a new kind of arresting gear for landing them, new radar, new reactors. It cost on the order of $13 billion. When you're about to trust systems that new and that expensive and that untested with the lives of thousands of sailors in combat, the argument for finding out how they behave under a real shock before you ever need them to becomes very hard to wave away. The shock trial is, in its own brutal way, an act of care wearing the mask of an act of destruction. And I want you to picture the actual moment, because the footage from these trials, when the Navy has released it, is genuinely something to see. There is the ship, huge, hundreds of feet of steel sitting on a calm sea. Then, off to one side, the water erupts. A white dome of ocean punches up into the sky, a wall of spray taller than the ship itself, and a shock ripples across the surface in a visible ring. A heartbeat later, the sound arrives. The ship lurches, and then it just sits there, floating, having taken a blow meant to simulate an act of war. To the sailors aboard, it feels like the whole world was struck with a hammer. To a seismometer 400 miles away in Georgia or the Carolinas, it feels like a small earthquake. And to a person refreshing an app in their kitchen, it becomes a dot on a map with a label that makes no sense. Now, the Navy is not shy about the fact that it does this. In its own statements, the language is dry and institutional. Full ship shock trials, they say, confirm that a ship's design and its crew can continue to meet demanding mission requirements under the harsh conditions they might encounter in battle. That is the whole rationale, and honestly, it is not a sinister one. If you're going to send a ship and its sailors into a war zone, testing whether it can survive a near miss is a reasonable, even responsible thing to do. There is a version of this story where the shock trial is simply good engineering, careful, deliberate, keeping people alive. I want to be fair to that version, because it is real, and because the point of this channel has never been to manufacture a villain where there is only a bureaucracy doing a difficult job. But here is where the fairness runs into the friction, and where the central thread of this whole story starts to tighten. If this is all so routine, so justified, so openly explained by the Navy when asked, then why does it keep arriving in the public consciousness as a shock, as a mystery, as a magnitude 3.9 that sends people into a spiral of screenshots and worst-case theories? Why is there such a gap between how ordinary this is on the inside and how alien it looks from the outside? Part of the answer, as we'll see, is that the two institutions involved almost never speak at the same time. The Geological Survey posts the seismic fact instantly, automatically to the whole world. The Navy confirms the operational reason later, quietly, if at all. And into that gap, that lag of hours between the reading and the reason, the entire mystery is born. There is something else buried in that £40,000 number, though. Something that starts to answer a question you might not have thought to ask yet. If these blasts are this enormous, and this loud, and this detectable, why do they always seem to happen in the same place? Why off Florida? Why not off Virginia, or out in the deep mid-Atlantic, or anywhere else along thousands of miles of coastline? The answer is not random, and it is not convenience. There is a specific, defined box of ocean where this is allowed to happen, drawn with real edges on a real map, and understanding why that box exists where it sits and what lives inside it is the next piece of the puzzle. Because the location is not an accident. It was chosen, and the reasons it was chosen are where this story begins to turn. Part 4. The box off Mayport. There is a shape drawn on the ocean off the coast of Florida that you will never see from a boat. It has no buoys marking it, no line in the water, nothing visible at all, but it is as real as any border, and it explains why this keeps happening in the same place. When the Navy chose where to conduct these trials, it did not throw a dart at the Atlantic. It defined a specific test area, and for the 2016 series that geometry was described precisely, a narrow hexagon, bounded on its western side by the 600-foot depth contour and on its outer edge by an arc reaching 120 nautical miles out, centered on Naval Station Mayport, Florida. That box is the reason. Not a fault, not a feature of the seabed, not anything natural. A permitted polygon drawn by people sitting off the northeast Florida coast, and every constraint that defines that box tells you something about what the Navy was trying to balance. The western edge, the 600-foot depth line, exists because the water has to be deep enough. You cannot set off 18 tons of explosive in shallow water near the coast without the shock reflecting and amplifying in ways that are both dangerous and useless for the test. You need real depth beneath the ship, but you also cannot go too far out because the ship has to be reachable, supportable, close enough to Mayport, which is a major naval station right there at the mouth of the St. Johns River near Jacksonville. So the outer arc, the 120 nautical mile limit, keeps everything within operational range of home. Deep enough to be safe, close enough to be practical. The box is the answer to those two demands, and it does not move because the demands do not change. To really understand the box, you have to understand the place it is anchored to. Naval Station Mayport sits at the mouth of the St. Johns River, just east of Jacksonville, on the northeastern coast of Florida. It is one of the largest naval installations on the eastern seaboard, a deep water port and home base for a substantial fleet, with the ship handling infrastructure and the support facilities a major operation requires. When you are going to take a brand new warship out, subject it to a series of enormous shocks over several weeks, and bring it back repeatedly for inspection between each blast, you need a serious naval base within reach. Mayport is that base, so the entire test box is drawn around it, 120 nautical miles of reach, centered on the one place that can actually support the operation. The western edge, that 600-foot depth contour, traces something real in the shape of the seafloor. Off the coast of the southeastern United States, the land does not simply drop into the abyss. It reaches outward first as a continental shelf, a shallow submerged shoulder, before the seabed plunges away into deeper water. The 600-foot line roughly marks where that shelf gives way to real depth. And depth matters for a shock trial for concrete physical reasons. In water that is too shallow, the shock wave from the explosion reflects off the seabed and the surface, and interacts with itself in complicated, uncontrolled ways, and the seafloor itself can be scoured and damaged. You need enough water beneath the ship for the blast to behave predictably, for the test to be clean and repeatable and measurable. So the box is pushed out to where the water is deep enough to do the physics properly, but kept within range of the base that makes it possible. Every edge of that invisible hexagon is the resolution of a real constraint, none of which is arbitrary and none of which is secret. It is engineering and geography written into a permitted operating area. But it is also, again, completely unknown to the person on the beach or the person refreshing the map, who has no reason to know that the shape of the seafloor and the location of a naval base near Jacksonville together decide where the ocean will periodically be made to explode. That single fact dissolves one of the most unsettling parts of this whole story, the part that makes people reach for the word pattern in the darkest sense. When you see the same patch of ocean light up with an explosion in 2016, and again in 2021, and again in 2026, your mind wants to draw a line through those points and call it a conspiracy, a ritual, a target. But the reason they cluster is almost boringly logical. There is only one box where this is allowed to happen, and so every trial happens in that box. If you are going to keep testing new ships the same way, and the rules for where you can do it do not change, then of course the dots pile up in the same spot. The clustering is not evidence of something hidden, it is evidence of a rule being followed. But then there is the timing, and I will admit the timing is where even I had to slow down and check myself, because it is genuinely eerie before you understand it. These trials do not just happen in the same place, they happen at the same time of year. Look across the series and you keep landing in the same window, roughly June into July, the heart of summer. And when you dig into why, you find something that is both reassuring and in its own way, heavier than the conspiracy would have been. The Navy times these detonations to a seasonal window, chosen in part around the presence of marine life, around the migration patterns of the animals that live in and move through that stretch of ocean. In other words, the calendar is not arbitrary, and it is not mystical. It is an environmental accommodation. They pick the window when they believe the fewest vulnerable animals are in the box. Which brings us to a coincidence I have to show you, because it is the kind of thing that, taken alone, would set the internet on fire, and taken in context, teaches you exactly how these false patterns are born. The 2016 trial series had 3 separate blasts. The third and final one of that series fell on July 16, 2016. This new event, the one that started this whole story, happened on July 16, 2026, the same calendar date, 10 years apart to the day. If you wanted to build a mystery, you could stop right there and let people's imaginations do the rest. The 16th of July, a decade apart, the same ocean. It sounds like a code, and it is nothing of the kind. It is what happens when you run the same activity, in the same box, inside the same summer window, year after year. The dates are going to collide. Mid-July is squarely inside the permitted season, so of course, a blast from one campaign and a blast from another, 10 years apart, can land on the same day. It is not destiny. It is the pigeonhole principle wearing a trench coat. But I show it to you deliberately, because this is the exact mechanism by which a completely ordinary schedule gets mistaken for a hidden design. Our brains are pattern-finding machines, and when you hand them a repeated place and a repeated season, They will manufacture intent out of pure arithmetic. The coincidence of the 16th is real. The meaning we are tempted to pour into it is not. Now here is the turn, the thing that keeps this from being a comforting little debunk and pulls it back toward the centre of the story. Everything I just told you, the depth requirement, the range limit, the marine life window, all of it is publicly knowable. The box has edges that were written down. The season has reasons that were documented. This is not secret geometry. And yet, standing on the shore, or refreshing that map in your kitchen, you had no idea any of it existed. You did not know there was a polygon off Florida where the ocean is periodically detonated. You did not know there was a season for it. You did not know the 16th of July had a decade-old twin. The information was available and the awareness was absent, and that gap between what is disclosed and what is known is going to turn out to be the real subject of this entire video. Because a box you were never told about, used for a purpose you were never briefed on a schedule set partly around animals you never think about, is not technically a secret. But it functions as one, for you, right up until the afternoon it trips the earthquake alarm and forces itself into your feed, and the moment it does, you are meeting for the first time a program that has been running quietly for at least a decade. So let us actually go back and meet it. Let us go back to the first time this ocean was logged as exploding, to 2016, to a ship whose name almost nobody remembers, and to the moment this whole strange, recurring signal entered the record and began the count that would reach 9. Part 5. The first time. The ocean exploded. The count begins with a ship called the USS Jackson, and almost no one outside the Navy would recognize the name. It was a literal combat ship, one of the smaller, faster vessels designed to operate close to shore, and in the early summer of 2016 it became the first ship in 8 years to be put through a full ship shock trial. The last one before, it had been all the way back in 2008. So when the Jackson sailed out to that box off Florida in June of 2016, it was reopening a practice that had gone quiet for the better part of a decade. And in doing so, it wrote the first entry in the ledger we are now reading 10 years later. The Jackson's trial ran as a series of 3, exactly as these things are designed to. The first blast came on June 10th, 2016, the second on June 23rd, the third on July 16th, 2016, and yes, that is the date I told you about, the one that would find its decade-later twin. Between each detonation, the ship returned to port at Naval Station Mayport for inspection and data collection, then went back out to take the next, closer, harder shock. The charges were smaller than what a carrier would later face, on the order of £10,000 each, and the Geological Survey caught all 3, logging them as experimental explosions with magnitudes around 3.7 to 3.8. Slightly smaller than the 2026 event, but the same species of signal from the same box under the same label. It is worth pausing on what the Jackson actually was, because it tells you how routine this had already become by 2016. The literal combat ship was a class built for a specific idea. Fast, relatively small, flexible vessels meant to operate close to shore, in the littoral zone, the near coastal waters where larger ships are more exposed. The program was controversial for all sorts of reasons that do not concern us here, but the relevant point is that these were not exotic experimental one-offs. They were production warships, built in numbers, and the Navy needed to know they could take a hit. So the Jackson was put through the same fundamental ordeal a carrier would later face, scaled to its size, with charges on the order of £10,000 rather than the £40,000 a carrier would absorb, and the rhythm of that 2016 series is worth walking through because it is the template for everything that came after. The first blast on June 10th. Then the ship steamed back to Mayport where engineers spent days climbing through it, inspecting, measuring, collecting data, checking what had held and what had not. Then back out to sea for the second blast on June 23rd. Closer this time, harder. Back to port again, and finally the third and closest detonation on July 16th. 3 blasts, roughly 5 weeks, 1 ship, 1 box, a methodical ladder of escalating shock with inspection at every step. Once you understand that rhythm, the recurrence of these signals stops being mysterious and starts being almost metronomic. A shock trial is not an event, it is a season. The fact that the Jackson was the first ship in 8 years to undergo this ordeal also tells you something about the tempo of the whole practice. This is not happening constantly. It happens when a new class of ship reaches the point in its life where it needs to be certified for combat, which is rare and clustered and then quiet again for years. The 8-year gap before the Jackson, the 5 years between the Jackson and the Ford, these are the natural spacings of a practice tied to the slow rhythm of building new warships, and that irregular, years-long spacing is a big part of why the public never builds up any familiarity with it. By the time the next one happens, the last one has long since faded from memory, if it was ever noticed at all. And here is a detail that I find quietly beautiful, in the way that good science often is. Those 2016 blasts were, in the words of the researchers who studied them, well recorded across the eastern United States. Seismologists did not treat them as a nuisance or an oddity. They treated them as a gift. Because a shock trial is something almost unheard of in the natural world. An explosion whose exact size, exact location, and exact timing are all known in advance. Nature never tells you when it is about to move, but the Navy, in effect, announced these to the instruments, and that let scientists use them to test and calibrate their own networks, to check how accurately they could locate a known source, how well they could measure its size, how cleanly they could tell it apart from a real earthquake. The very blasts that would one day frighten the public were, to seismologists, a rare chance to check their homework against an answer key. I want to pause on that inversion because it captures something essential about this whole story. The same event can be a mystery to one person and a calibration standard to another, depending entirely on what they know walking in. To the researcher, the July 16, 2016 blast was a clean, labelled, understood data point, useful precisely because there was no mystery in it at all. To a member of the public who stumbled onto it, it was an unexplained explosion off their coastline. Nothing about the event changed between those two people, only the context did, and that is the thread I keep pulling on, because it is the real engine of everything here, the difference between a thing being knowable and a thing being known. So the Jackson set the template, 3 blasts, 1 box, 1 summer, 1 label repeating in the record. But a literal combat ship is a relatively modest vessel, and the charges it faced, while enormous by any human standard, were the smaller end of what these trials involve. If the story had stopped there, it might have stayed a footnote, a curiosity for the handful of people who watch seismic feeds for a living. What turned this from a footnote into something the whole country would periodically trip over was what came 5 years later, when the Navy decided to shock test not a small combat ship, but the largest and most expensive warship it had ever built. And when they did, the number of pounds in the water jumped by a factor of 4, and the seismic signal jumped with it, and for the first time this quiet program broke through into the national news. But before we get there, sit for a moment with what the Jackson really established, because it is more than a template. It established a rhythm. It proved that the Navy would, on a recurring basis, take a new ship out to a fixed box off a populated American coast and detonate thousands of pounds of explosive next to it, and that the event would be logged, publicly, under a phrase most people would never understand, and that almost no one would notice or object. It established that this could become normal, and normal is a powerful thing. Normal is how a decade of detonations accumulates in a public database, with barely a ripple of public awareness. The Jackson did not just fire the first shot, it proved the silence would hold. There is one more thing worth saying about that first trial, and it points forward to everything still coming. When the Navy planned the Jackson's shock trial, and everyone after it, it did not simply pick a spot and light the fuse. There was an entire apparatus behind it, a whole machinery of environmental review, marine life monitoring, and federal authorization that had to be satisfied before a single charge went into the water. That machinery is the part of the story that lives farthest from the seismographs and closest to the water itself, and it is where the real weight of this eventually settles. But we are not ready for it yet. First, we have to watch this program grow up. We have to watch it go from a small combat ship and 10,000 pounds to the biggest warship on Earth and 40,000 pounds. We have to watch the moment the seafloor off Florida shook hard enough that for once the country actually looked. That moment came in 2021, and it had a name that everyone would recognize. Part 6. The Carrier. The USS Gerald R. Ford is the most expensive warship ever built. It is a Ford-class aircraft carrier, the lead ship of a new generation, more than 1,000 feet of steel displacing around 100,000 tons, a floating city with a price tag north of $13 billion. and in the summer of 2021, the Navy took that ship with its crew aboard out to the box off Florida and set off roughly 40,000 pounds of explosive next to it. On purpose. 3 times. It was the first time an American aircraft carrier had been subjected to a full ship shock trial since 1987, when the Navy shock tested the USS Theodore Roosevelt. 34 years had passed between one carrier trial and the next, and when the Ford's turn came, the ocean off Florida shook hard enough that the whole country, for once, felt the edge of it. The first blast came on June 18th, 2021, and there it is again, that pattern of dates. The second event of the Ford series fell on July 16, 2021, and the third on August 8, July 16th, the same date as the final Jackson blast in 2016, and the same date 5 years later still as the event that started this video in 2026. 3 different years, 3 different ships, and that one date, the 16th of July, keeps recurring for the reason we already uncovered. It sits in the heart of the summer testing window, and so it catches blast after blast, campaign after campaign. Once you know why, the date stops being spooky. But I will be honest with you, the first time you line those 3 years up and see the 16th staring back at you 3 times, it does something to the back of your neck. What made the Ford trial different was not just the size of the charge, though £40,000 is 4 times what the Jackson faced. It was that the Navy released footage, and the footage is unforgettable. You see the carrier, this vast grey slab of a ship, sitting on a nearly flat sea. Then, off its flank, the ocean detonates. A white mountain of water erupts upward, a dome of spray that rises higher than the flight deck, and a visible shock ring races out across the surface. The ship heaves. Sailors aboard later described it as the entire world being struck with a sledgehammer, a jolt that ran through the deck and up through their boots and rattled their teeth. And then it is over, and the carrier is just floating there, having absorbed a blow designed to mimic a torpedo strike, its system still running. It is, genuinely, an astonishing thing to witness. It is also, unmistakably, a bomb the size of a small earthquake going off in the sea. To feel the weight of the Ford trial, you have to understand how long the gap really was, and what filled it. The last time an American aircraft carrier had been put through a full ship shock trial was 1987, with the USS Theodore Roosevelt. Sit with that span. Between that trial and the Fords, the Cold War ended, the entire world reorganized itself, and several generations of technology came and went. An entire career's worth of naval engineers came up, served and retired in the interval between 2 carrier shock trials. So when the Ford's turn came in 2021, there was almost no living institutional memory of the last one in the public mind. It arrived, for all practical purposes, as if it were the first time it had ever happened, because for nearly everyone alive and paying attention, it was. And the Ford was worth the ordeal, from the Navy's point of view, precisely because it was so new and so unproven. This was the ship that had replaced the old steam catapults with an electromagnetic launch system, a fundamentally new way of throwing aircraft off the deck. It had new arresting gear, new radar, a new reactor design, 1,000 things that had never been tested in the shock of combat. A ship that novel, carrying technology that untried, was exactly the kind of vessel the shock trial process was built for. You do not need to shock test a design you already trust from decades of war. You shock test the one full of systems no one has ever seen bombed. So the 3 blasts of the Ford series, on June 18th, July 16th, and August 8th of 2021, were not routine box checking. They were the first real combat shock interrogation of the most advanced and most expensive warship ever built, and the fact that it came through them was, for the Navy, a genuine milestone. For the public, though, the milestone barely registered as anything but a strange earthquake reading and a day of confusion, quickly resolved and quickly forgotten. Even a $13 billion carrier being bombed on purpose could not hold the public's attention for more than a news cycle. And that 2021 blast is the one that first taught the public the shape of this confusion because it made real news. The Geological Survey logged it as a magnitude 3.9 event off the Florida coast, and for a brief window before the explanation caught up, people saw an earthquake reading where earthquakes do not happen, and reacted exactly the way they would react again 5 years later. There was a flurry of confusion, a wave of headlines, a scramble to explain that no, this was not a quake. This was the Navy blowing up the water next to its newest carrier. The story had a satisfying resolution once the Ford was named, because a $13 billion aircraft carrier is a concrete, understandable thing to attach an explosion to. Oh, they were shock testing the Ford. That makes sense. Case closed, and the public moved on and mostly forgot. But look closely at how that resolution worked, because it matters for what happens in 2026. The 2021 event became explicable the moment it had a name attached to it. The Ford, a specific, famous, enormous ship. The mystery collapsed into a fact because the missing piece, the identity of what was being tested, got filled in quickly and publicly. People could picture the carrier. They could look up its price and its length and its crew. The explosion stopped being a floating question mark and became an event with an owner. That is the difference between an unexplained signal and a known one, and in 2021 the gap between them closed fast. Hold that thought, because it is about to become the crux of everything. In 2016 we had a ship, the Jackson. In 2021 we had a ship, the Ford, and a famous one at that. The signal was strange, but each time eventually it got a name, and the name made it safe. The pattern the public absorbed, to whatever small degree it absorbed anything, was mysterious explosion off Florida, followed by reassuring explanation, followed by a specific ship, explosion, then answer, then name. That was the rhythm. That was how these events were metabolized on the rare occasions anyone noticed them at all. Now let me widen the lens, because the Ford trial also reveals the sheer span of time this practice covers, and that span is part of what makes it so easy to lose track of. 34 years passed between the Theodore Roosevelt carrier trial in 1987 and the Ford in 2021. A person could be born, grow up, and have children of their own in the time between two carrier shock trials. This is not a frequent event on the scale of a human life. It is rare enough that each occurrence arrives as if for the first time, to a public that has no living memory of the last one, and that rarity, that generational spacing for the biggest ships, is part of why the practice can run for decades and still ambush people every single time. You cannot build a habit of not being alarmed by something that happens once every few years, in a box you cannot see, under a label you were never taught. So by the time we reach 2026 we have a program with a real history. Two known ships, the Jackson and the Ford, two known charge sizes, £10,000 and £40,000, a fixed box off Mayport, a summer window, a recurring date, and a public rhythm of explosion, then answer, then name. Everything about the 2026 event fits that history. The seismic signature matched, the location matched, the season matched, the label matched. It was, in every measurable way, the next entry in a well-established series. The instruments recognized it instantly. The seismologists recognized it instantly. The Navy confirmed a shock trial had taken place. And yet. And here is where the 2026 event quietly breaks from its predecessors in a way that most of the coverage rushed right past. In 2016, we got the name, the Jackson. In 2021, we got the name, the Ford. The rhythm was explosion, then answer, then name. But in 2026, the rhythm stopped one beat short. There was an explosion. There was eventually an answer, yes, it was a shock trial. But the third beat, the name, the specific identity of the ship being tested, did not clearly arrive in the initial reporting the way it had before. The Navy confirmed the activity. It did not, in those first accounts, clearly confirm the vessel. And that missing beat, small as it sounds, is the loose thread hanging out of an otherwise fully explained event. So the real question the 2026 blast leaves us with is not what happened. We know what happened. The question is which ship the United States just certified for war off the coast of Florida, and why, this time, its name was the one piece the public did not get. Part 7. 9 times, and no one noticed. 9. According to the Geological Survey's own records, the July 16, 2026 event was the 9th explosion logged in this region since 2016. 9 deliberate detonations, each large enough to register on the earthquake network, each sitting in or around that same box off Florida, spread across a single decade. And I keep coming back to that number because of what it does to the story you thought you were watching. 1 explosion is an incident. 2 is a coincidence. 9 is a program. 9 is a standing practice, a thing this country does on a recurring basis, a ledger that has been quietly accumulating entries the entire time you were not looking. Let me account for the ones we can name so you can feel the shape of the count. The 2016 Jackson series was 3 blasts. The 2021 Ford series was 3 blasts. That is 6 right there. 2 campaigns of 3, 5 years apart. Add the 2026 event and you're at 7 of the 9 just from the ships we have already met, plus whatever else slipped into the record in between. Other trials, other tests, other charges in that water that never broke through into public awareness at all. The exact accounting matters less than the magnitude of the realization. This has happened enough times that the Eastern Seismic Network has, in effect, a decade-long recording of the United States periodically detonating its own coastline, and the number is not 1 or 2, it is at least 9. Let me give you a sense of just how routine this had to become to reach a count of 9. Spread 9 explosions across the decade from 2016 to 2026, and you're averaging close to 1 a year, though of course they do not fall evenly. They cluster into campaigns of 3 and then go quiet for years. 2 of those campaigns we can name outright, the 3 Jackson blasts of 2016 and the 3 Ford blasts of 2021. That is 6. Add the 2026 event and the additional trials and tests that entered the record in the years between without ever surfacing into public view, and you arrive at the 9 the Geological Survey's catalogue holds. Each of those was a deliberate detonation large enough to be felt across multiple states by instruments, and each one was, to the machinery that logged it, entirely unremarkable. And that word, unremarkable, is the whole point. For a signal to be logged 9 times over a decade and provoke almost no lasting public notice, it has to have crossed some threshold from event into background, from news into noise. A single magnitude 3.9 explosion off a populated coast ought to be a story. 9 of them ought to be a much bigger one. Instead, the 9th arrived and departed the way the first did, as a brief flare of confusion on a summer afternoon, because the practice had so thoroughly normalized itself, buried itself in correct procedure and clinical labels, that even its own repetition could not make it stick in the public mind. The ledger grew, and the awareness did not. That is not how a secret behaves. It is how a routine behaves, and every single one of those 9 was public. That is the part I cannot get past. This was never classified. It was never buried in some vault. Each of these events posted to the same open feed that anyone with a phone can watch, tagged with the same honest label, available to the entire world in real time. The information was sitting there, in public, the whole decade, 9 times, and the public awareness of it rounds to essentially 0, flaring up for a single confused afternoon whenever one of these happens to catch someone's eye, then vanishing again before the next one. This is not a story about hidden data. It is a story about disclosed data that nobody was equipped to read. The secret, if there even is one, is hiding in plain sight, wearing a lab coat, filed correctly. Now think about what it means that these come in series. The Jackson was 3 blasts over about 5 weeks. The Ford was 3 blasts over about 7 weeks. These are not one-and-done events. A shock trial is a campaign, a ladder of detonations that walks the charge closer to the ship step by step, with weeks of inspection in between. So when the 2026 event lit up the map on July 16th, the honest implication, if the pattern holds, is that it was probably not alone. It may have been the middle of a series, or the beginning of one, with more charges scheduled for the same box in the days and weeks around it. Which means the ocean off Florida may have shaken more than once this summer, quietly, in a rhythm most people will never track. The count of 9 is almost certainly not going to stay at 9. But let us return to the loose thread from a moment ago, because it is the genuine mystery this event leaves standing, and I do not want to wave it away. In 2016 we got the Jackson. In 2021 we got the Ford. In 2026 the ship did not clearly surface in the early reporting. The Navy confirmed a shock trial. The vessel itself stayed, at least initially, unnamed. And I want to be careful and fair here, because there are ordinary undramatic reasons that could be true. Operational security is routine for the Navy. It does not always broadcast the specifics of where its newest ships are and what is being done to them, especially in a tense world. The name may simply not have been released yet, or may have been released quietly to specialist outlets, while the public coverage stayed vague. I am not going to tell you the missing name is proof of something dark because I do not know that, and I will not pretend to. What I will tell you is that the missing name is the one place where the mystery is real instead of manufactured. Everything else about this event debunks cleanly. The explosion, explained. The location, explained. The label, explained. The recurrence, explained. The eerie date, explained. All of it collapses under a little knowledge. But the identity of the ship, the answer to what exactly the United States was certifying for combat in that box off Florida in the summer of 2026, that is the piece that did not get filled in on schedule. And there is something almost fitting about that. After all the false mysteries, all the theories that dissolve the moment you apply physics, the one true unknown left standing is the most mundane-sounding question of all. Not what force did this, not whether the Earth is waking up, just, which ship? What is it? Why now? Because the answer to that question is not really about the explosion at all. It is about what the explosion is for. A shock trial is the last exam a warship takes before it is trusted to carry sailors into combat. So a new shock trial means a new ship is being made ready. Somewhere, a vessel is being certified to survive being bombed, which means it is being prepared to go somewhere it might be. The blast off Florida is, in that sense, a small visible flake of a much larger and mostly invisible process, the constant grinding preparation of a military for the wars it anticipates. The magnitude 3.9 is the part that surfaces. The reason behind it stays underwater, in every sense. And that is where I have to turn the ship around, so to speak, and point us at the part of this story that almost no coverage of these events ever reaches, because so far we have talked about this entirely from above the waterline, the seismographs, the ledger, the ships, the public confusion, all of it happening on maps and feeds and news sites in the human world of data and institutions. But the explosion did not happen in the human world. It happened in the water, and the water was not empty. Whatever else a shock trial is, an engineering exam, a data point, a dot on a map, it is first and most physically an 18-ton bomb going off in a living ocean, and the things that live in that ocean do not read the geological survey feed and were not consulted about the season and could not leave the box. So let us finally go down there, beneath the white dome of spray, into the water at the moment of the blast and ask the question that the whole apparatus above the surface is built, in part, to keep you from asking. What does 40,000 pounds of explosive do to the living things that were already there? Part 8. What it does. To the living ocean. Water does not forgive an explosion the way air does. On land, when a blast goes off, the pressure wave spreads through the air and thins out quickly, and a person a few hundred yards away might feel a thump and a gust and walk away unhurt. Underwater, the rules change completely, and they change against anything alive. Because water is nearly incompressible, it does not cushion the shock. It transmits it, almost perfectly, over enormous distances. The same property that makes a shock trial register on seismographs 400 miles away, that efficient coupling of energy into the sea, is the same property that makes the water itself a weapon against the creatures inside it. The ocean carries the blow, and it carries it far. To understand why that is so dangerous to a living body, you have to understand what an underwater explosion actually produces. It is not a single push. It is, first, a shock front, an almost instantaneous spike of pressure that races outward faster than sound in water. And then, behind it, something stranger. A bubble of superheated gas that expands, overshoots, collapses back in on itself and expands again, pulsing, sending out a series of secondary pressure waves as it oscillates. So a body in the water near the blast is not struck once. It is struck by the initial shock and then hammered again by the throb of that collapsing bubble, a rapid sequence of violent pressure changes. Now here is the cruel part. The reason this is so much worse for animals than the raw energy alone would suggest. A pressure wave passes through water, and it passes through flesh, which is mostly water, almost seamlessly. Muscle, blood, most soft tissue, the wave slides right through, because they have nearly the same density as the water around them. But the moment that wave hits an air-filled space inside the body, everything changes. Air is compressible where flesh is not. So at every boundary between tissue and air, the wave slams, compresses the gas, and tears at the delicate membranes around it. And the bodies of ocean animals are full of exactly those boundaries. The lungs of a whale or a dolphin, the swim bladder of a fish, that gas-filled sac they use to control their buoyancy, the air-filled sinuses and the fragile structures around the ears that marine mammals depend on to hear. These are the places a shock wave does its damage, rupturing tissue, hemorrhaging, destroying the very organs an animal needs to breathe, to float, and to navigate its world through sound. Scientists who study blast injury in the water actually break the harm down into stages, and walking through them makes the danger concrete. The first is what they call primary blast injury, the direct effect of that initial pressure spike passing through the body and shredding the boundaries between tissue and air. That is the lung damage, the ear damage, the ruptured gas-filled organs. The second stage comes from the oscillating bubble I described, the way the gas globe expands and collapses and expands again, delivering repeated pressure pulses that can extend and worsen the initial injuries. And there are further effects still, the violent water motion that can throw an animal, the disorientation, the panic. A body caught close to an underwater detonation is not simply pushed. It is subjected to a rapid compound assault aimed at exactly the organs an ocean animal cannot live without. And the box off Florida is not biologically empty. The waters off the southeastern United States host a real community of marine mammals, bottlenose dolphins, Atlantic spotted dolphins, pilot whales, and a range of other species that move through these waters as part of the living Atlantic. Below them, the water column and the seabed teem with fish, and fish carry that gas-filled swim bladder that makes them acutely vulnerable to blast pressure, which is why underwater explosions are known to leave rafts of dead and stunned fish floating at the surface. The box is not a sterile test range. It is a slice of a functioning ecosystem that happens to sit at a convenient distance and depth from a naval base. For the great whales, the ones whose hearing reaches across enormous distances, the injury radius is not an abstraction, but a matter of survival, because their entire existence is organized around sound. They find food with it. They find each other with it, across miles of open water. They navigate with it, sense danger with it, raise their young inside a web of calls. Take an animal like that and damage its hearing, and you have not merely hurt it. You have cut it off from the sensory world it depends on to do everything, potentially condemning it to a slow decline in a sea it can no longer read. That is why the 10-kilometre injury figure is so much more serious than it sounds. For a creature of sound, a wound to the ears is a wound to the whole life, and this damage does not stay confined to a small circle right at the blast. Because the water transmits the pressure so efficiently, the harm radiates outward in expanding rings of decreasing severity. The Navy's own modelling for these kinds of events describes it in exactly those terms. Close to the detonation, within a kilometre or two, smaller marine mammals can be killed outright. Further out, the injury does not stop, it just changes character, and the most common and insidious injury is to hearing. Out to something like 10 kilometres from the blast, marine mammals can suffer hearing damage, including permanent hearing loss. And for an animal that lives by sound, that hunts and navigates and finds its family and senses danger through hearing, deafness is not a minor injury. It can be a slow death sentence, an animal set adrift in a silent world it was never built to survive in. Let me put that 10-kilometre figure in perspective, because it is easy to say and hard to feel. 10 kilometres is more than 6 miles. Draw a circle 6 miles in every direction from the point of detonation, and you have enclosed well over 100 square miles of ocean. That is the potential injury footprint of a single blast, not a small patch of disturbed water, a zone larger than many cities throughout which the pressure could be enough to harm the hearing of an animal that happened to be swimming there. And a shock trial is not one blast. It is a series. So you are not drawing that circle once. You are drawing it again and again, over weeks, in a stretch of ocean that is not a dead zone, that is not empty, that is in fact part of the living Atlantic, a highway and a habitat for some of the most remarkable and in some cases most endangered animals on the planet. Because that box off Florida is not a featureless void that happens to be convenient, the waters off the southeastern United States are part of the range of whales and dolphins of many species, and critically, they sit near the migratory corridor and the calving grounds of one of the rarest large animals left alive, the North Atlantic right whale. There are only a few hundred North Atlantic right whales remaining on Earth, somewhere in the low hundreds, a population so small and so fragile that the loss of even a single breeding female is a measurable blow to the survival of the entire species. These are animals that migrate down the eastern seaboard, that bring their calves into the warm waters off Florida and Georgia in the winter. They are already hunted to the edge by ship strikes and fishing gear entanglement. They live permanently, one bad decade away from disappearing entirely, and their world overlaps, in space, with the box. I want to be careful and precise here, because this is exactly the kind of place where it would be easy to overreach, and I promised you I would not. The Navy times its trials, as we established, partly to avoid the seasons when the most vulnerable animals are present. The summer window is chosen, in part because the right whales are largely elsewhere then, up in their northern feeding grounds. So I'm not telling you that a shock trial is aimed at right whales, or that it routinely kills them, because the entire timing apparatus exists to reduce exactly that risk. That is the honest picture. But I am telling you that the potential is structurally there, that we are detonating enormous charges in an ocean that is home to animals for whom a single injury matters at the level of the species, and that the entire defense against catastrophe rests on the accuracy of the timing, the thoroughness of the monitoring, and the honesty of the modelling. The margin is not comfortable. It is a bet placed every summer that the box will be empty enough. And this is the moment the whole story pivots, because everything I just described, the lethal radius, the injury zone, the endangered animals, the seasonal bet, none of it is a secret, none of it is unregulated, and none of it is an accident. That is what makes it so much heavier than any conspiracy could be. If this harm were hidden, if the Navy were sneaking out to sea and blowing up whales in the dark and covering it up, that would be a scandal, but it would also be a solvable one, a matter of exposure and accountability. The reality is stranger and, I think, more uncomfortable than that. The harm is not hidden. It is anticipated. It is calculated in advance, written into federal documents, assigned numbers, and legally permitted before a single charge ever touches the water. There is a whole apparatus of paperwork whose entire purpose is to look at the deaths and injuries this will cause, count them, and sign off on them ahead of time. And that apparatus, that quiet machinery of permitted harm, is the part of this story that I think should genuinely change how you see the dot on the map. So let us go read the paperwork. Part 9. The paperwork of permitted harm. There is a word the federal government uses for what happens to a marine mammal when a Navy explosion harms it. The word is take. To take an animal, in the language of the Marine Mammal Protection Act, means to harass it, injure it, or kill it. And before the Navy can conduct an activity that it knows will take marine mammals, it has to go to the National Marine Fisheries Service, part of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and apply for permission to do so. Not permission to try to avoid harm, permission to cause it. The authorization is called an incidental take authorization, and it is in essence a license to injure and kill a legally protected number of animals in the course of a permitted activity. That document is the beating heart of this entire story, and almost no one who saw the dot on the map that afternoon knows it exists. Think about what that actually means, procedurally. Long before a ship ever sails out to the box, before a single charge is lowered into the water, there is a process. The Navy estimates, using models, how many marine mammals of each species are likely to be killed, how many seriously injured, and how many subjected to lesser harm, temporary hearing shifts, behavioral disruption, the stress of a shockwave passing through their world. Those estimates are submitted, they are reviewed, and then a federal agency issues a document that says, in effect, yes, you may proceed, and you are authorized to take up to this many animals in the process. The harm is not an unfortunate surprise, it is a line item. It is quantified, negotiated, and approved in advance, with the numbers written down. And the numbers, when you widen out to the Navy's broader testing and training programs in the Atlantic, are not small. In the environmental modelling the Navy has produced for its overall Atlantic fleet training and testing activities, the kind of analysis that underlies these authorizations, the projected impacts across multi-year periods have run into the extraordinary. On the order of a couple hundred marine mammal deaths, many thousands, into the tens of thousands of serious injuries, and minor takes, the behavioral disturbances and temporary effects, numbering into the millions. I want to be scrupulously accurate about this. Those largest figures describe the entire Atlantic training and testing enterprise over years, the sonar, the gunnery, the countless exercises, not a single shock trial by itself. A shock trial is one activity within that vast program, but the point is not to pin a precise body count on one blast. The point is that this is the scale of harm the system is built to accommodate, and that it accommodates it not by preventing it, but by authorizing it. The law even sorts the harm into tiers, and the tiers tell their own story. Under the framework the Fisheries Service uses, there is what is called Level A harassment, which covers the serious end, the potential to injure a marine mammal, up to and including permanent injury. and there is Level B harassment, the lesser category, which covers disruption without injury, the behavioural disturbance, the temporary shift in hearing, the animal fleeing or ceasing to feed or abandoning an area because a shock has torn through its world. When the Navy applies for one of these authorizations, it is asking for a permitted number of takes in each category, so many at Level A, so many at Level B, per species, over the life of the authorization. The suffering is not only anticipated, it is itemized by severity, like a menu, and approved line by line. The authorizations also come with defined seasons written right into them. Historically, the take authorizations tied to these Atlantic shock trial activities have specified windows running through the warmer months, roughly from the beginning of May into September, precisely the period chosen to avoid the times when the most sensitive animals are most likely to be present. So the summer timing we keep circling back to is not an informal habit. It is a legal condition, baked into the permit, an official acknowledgement that when you detonate this box matters as much as where, because the ocean's occupancy changes with the calendar. The whole apparatus is, in its way, an admission that this is dangerous enough to require careful scheduling around the lives of animals, and the fights over whether all of this is enough have reached the courts, which is the clearest sign that these are not settled questions. Conservation organizations have repeatedly challenged federal authorizations for activities that harm marine mammals, and in some cases judges have agreed that the government approved more harm than the law permits, striking down or sending back approvals as violations of the very statutes meant to protect these animals. The North Atlantic right whale, with a population somewhere in the low hundreds and every individual precious, sits at the centre of many of these disputes. So when you look at that dot on the map and the machinery behind it, you are not looking at a closed, agreed-upon system. You are looking at the visible surface of a decades-long, unresolved legal and ethical struggle over how much of the ocean's life we are willing to spend on readiness, and whether the paperwork that spends it is honest enough about what it is doing. So the Navy is not, in any simple sense, breaking a rule. It is following one. And here is the philosophical hinge that I keep turning over, the thing that makes this so much more disquieting to me than a hidden crime would be. A hidden crime implies a rule being violated in the dark. This is the opposite. This is a rule being followed in the open, a rule whose entire function is to make an acceptable quantity of death and injury legal, predictable, and administratively clean. The paperwork does not exist to stop the harm. It exists to permit it, to put it inside a framework, to give it a number and a signature and a defined ceiling. And you can, if you want, see that as exactly how a responsible society should handle an unavoidable cost. Transparently, with limits, with review. Or you can see it as the most unsettling thing in this entire story, the moment where killing protected animals becomes a form filled out in triplicate. I genuinely think both readings are defensible, and I think the discomfort lives in the fact that they are both true at once. Now, to be fair, the same paperwork that permits the harm also demands the mitigation, and the mitigation is real. These authorizations come with conditions, and the Navy takes measures that are not for show. Before and during a shock trial, there are marine mammal observers, trained people whose entire job is to watch the water for whales and dolphins. There are aerial surveys, aircraft flying the test area looking for animals in the danger zone. If a protected animal is spotted inside a defined exclusion radius, the detonation is supposed to be delayed until the animal leaves. The timing of the whole operation, that summer window we keep returning to, is itself a mitigation, chosen to avoid the seasons when the most vulnerable species, including the right whales, are most likely to be present. This is not nothing. It represents real effort and real expense to reduce a real harm, and the people doing that watching are in many cases genuinely trying to protect these animals. But sit with the strangeness of that arrangement for a moment, because it is genuinely surreal when you picture it. There is a warship in the water, wired to survive a simulated torpedo attack. There are engineers ready to detonate 18 tons of explosive, and there are also people in aircraft and on boats, scanning the sea, hoping not to see a whale, because if they see one, they have to stop. The same operation that is prepared to injure marine mammals within a permitted limit is simultaneously spending real resources trying to make sure no specific animal is in the wrong place at the wrong moment. It is harm and care, running on the same clock, funded by the same budget, aimed at the same patch of ocean. And whether the care is enough is not a question anyone can answer with certainty, because you cannot survey every cubic mile of a moving ocean, and a whale can dive, and the water is vast and the models are only models, this tension has not gone unchallenged, and I want you to know that, because it means these questions are not just mine, invented for a video. The broader issue of Navy activities and their toll on marine mammals, and the fate of the North Atlantic right whale in particular, has been the subject of real legal fights. Conservation groups have gone to court over federal authorizations for activities that harm marine mammals, arguing that the government has approved more harm than the law should allow, especially for a species as close to the edge as the right whale. Courts have at times agreed, finding that certain federal approvals violated the very laws meant to protect these animals. So this is a live, contested, ongoing argument playing out in the legal system about how much permitted harm is too much, and about whether the paperwork that authorizes it is doing enough to hold the line. The dot on the map is one small, loud surfacing of a decades-long unresolved struggle over what we are allowed to do to the ocean in the name of readiness. And this is where the central thread of this whole story pulls tight, so let me say it plainly. When you saw experimental explosion on that map and felt that something was wrong, your instinct was correct, but your aim was off. The wrong thing is not a secret weapon or a triggered earthquake or a hidden catastrophe. The wrong thing, if it is wrong at all, is right here in the paperwork. It is that we have built a smooth, legal, administrative machine for detonating a living ocean on a schedule, for counting the animals it will kill before it kills them, for signing off on that toll in advance, and for doing all of it so quietly, so correctly, so procedurally, that the loudest reaction it ever provokes is a single afternoon of confused screenshots from people who do not even know the machine exists. The horror, if you find it horrifying, is not that it is hidden. It is that it is disclosed and permitted and normal and still invisible. But I have been telling you this machine is invisible, and that is not quite the whole truth, because there is one set of eyes that never looks away from that box, one system that has been recording every single one of these blasts with perfect attention for the entire decade. It is not watching for whales, and it is not watching for the Navy. It is watching for something else entirely, something that would be the most catastrophic sound a human being could ever make. And every time the Navy lights up that box off Florida, this system hears it, logs it, and uses it, quietly, to sharpen itself for the day it might have to catch a very different kind of explosion. To understand what has really been listening off the coast of Florida this whole time, we have to talk about the machines that were built to hear the end of the world. Part 10. The machines that were listening. There is a global network of instruments spread across the entire planet, built for one purpose above all others, to make sure that no country can secretly detonate a nuclear weapon without the rest of the world knowing. It listens with seismometers planted in the ground, with hydrophones suspended in the deep ocean, with sensors that detect the faint infrasound rumble that travels through the atmosphere, and with stations that sniff the air for telltale radioactive particles. It is one of the most sophisticated sensing systems humanity has ever assembled, and its job is to catch the single most dangerous sound a human being can make. And that system, along with the ordinary earthquake networks run by the Geological Survey, has been listening to the box off Florida the entire time. Here is the thing that connects it to our story. To a sensor built to detect a clandestine nuclear test, a full ship shock trial is not a nuisance. It is a rehearsal. Because the fundamental scientific challenge is the same one we walked through earlier, telling a deliberate explosion apart from a natural earthquake, and doing it from far away, from the waves alone. That is precisely the problem the nuclear monitoring world lives and dies by. If a nation set off a bomb underground and tried to pass it off as a quake, or if a quake happened somewhere sensitive and had to be ruled out as a possible test, the entire question of war and peace could hinge on whether analysts could read the difference in the seismic signature. And the only way to get good at reading that difference is to practice on explosions whose size, location, and timing you already know. That is exactly what a shock trial provides. It is a large, known, precisely located, precisely timed explosion, announced in effect to the instruments by the very fact that it is scheduled and recorded. So every time the Navy detonates that box off Florida, the scientists who run these monitoring systems get a gift, a clean, unambiguous explosion to test themselves against. They can check how accurately their networks pinpoint the source. They can measure how well their algorithms flag it as a blast rather than a quake. They can calibrate the whole apparatus of global explosion detection against an answer they already hold. The 2016 blasts, as I mentioned, were studied precisely this way, treated as calibration events for the networks that watch the eastern United States and beyond. The explosion that frightened the public was, to these scientists, a tuning fork. The system I am describing is not a metaphor. It is a real, standing, global apparatus built under an international treaty to detect nuclear explosions anywhere on Earth, and it leans on 4 different sensors working together. There are seismic stations planted in the ground worldwide that feel the shaking a blast sends through rock. There are hydroacoustic stations, hydrophones suspended in the deep ocean, that listen to the water itself, because sound travels through the sea with astonishing efficiency, carrying for thousands of miles along a natural channel in the ocean where the physics traps and guides it. There are infrasound arrays that catch the low, below hearing pressure waves. An explosion pushes through the atmosphere, and there are radionuclide stations that sniff the air for the radioactive fingerprints only a nuclear detonation leaves behind. Together, hundreds of these stations form a planet-spanning net designed to make a secret nuclear test very nearly impossible to hide. Now think about where a Navy shock trial off Florida sits inside that net. It is a large underwater explosion in the open ocean, exactly the kind of event those hydroacoustic sensors were built to catch, exactly the kind of signal the seismic stations were built to locate and classify. To that global system, the shock trial is a loud, clean, perfectly documented example of an underwater blast delivered on a schedule, with the size and location and timing all known in advance. There is almost nothing more useful to a monitoring network than a known explosion to test itself against, because the entire difficulty of the job is calibration, making sure that when an unknown event arrives, the system reads its size and location and nature correctly. Every shock trial is a chance to confirm the net is tuned, that a real event of that size in that ocean would be caught and measured accurately. So the same instruments that let a member of the public stumble onto a frightening dot off Florida are part of the machinery that stands between the world and an undetected nuclear test. The blast that reads as a mystery in a kitchen reads as a calibration standard in a monitoring center. It is the same wave, the same energy, the same event, arriving at 2 utterly different kinds of listener. And that split, more than anything else in this story, is what I keep turning over, because it shows so cleanly that the meaning of a signal is not in the signal, it is in the receiver. And I find something genuinely profound in that, something that lifts this story up out of its own grimness for a moment. The same event lives 3 completely different lives depending on who is receiving it. To the public, it is a mysterious, alarming dot that whispers something is wrong. To the Navy, it is an engineering exam, a box checked on the road to sending a ship to sea. And to the community of scientists who stand watch against nuclear catastrophe, it is a precious calibration, a chance to make sure that if the real thing ever comes, they will recognize it instantly and correctly. 1 blast, 3 meanings, and which one you perceive depends entirely on what you know when the wave arrives. That, again, is the deepest current running under this entire story. Not the explosion itself, but the vast difference between the same fact received by an informed mind and an uninformed one. There is a quiet reassurance buried in this, and I want to give it to you, because this channel is not only in the business of dread. The fact that these monitoring systems exist, that they are this good, that they can distinguish a Navy shock trial from an earthquake, from a mine collapse from a nuclear test, is one of the underappreciated safety nets of the modern world. It means that the surface of the planet is, in a real sense, watched. It means that a nation cannot easily light off a secret bomb and hide it inside the noise of nature. And it means that when something like this happens off Florida, the people whose job is to know almost instantly, with confidence, exactly what it is. The system worked on July 16th. It flinched, it read the signal, and the experts understood it within moments. The only people left in the dark were the ones who were never handed the key. But notice what that reassurance costs, and how it loops right back to the thread. The system knew, the Navy knew, the scientists knew. Everyone whose profession it is to understand these signals understood this one perfectly and almost immediately. The knowledge existed, fully formed, in the right hands, from the first second. What did not exist was any bridge between that knowledge and the public, and so millions of people met a fully understood event as a total mystery, not because the information was missing from the world, but because it was missing from them. This is the shape of the whole thing, over and over, a fact that is completely known somewhere and completely absent everywhere else, separated by nothing but the thin, uncrossed gap of communication. And it is into that gap, that lag between a thing being understood by the few and explained to the many, that the theories rush. Because human beings cannot tolerate a vacuum where an explanation should be. When the seafloor shakes off your coast and the only label attached to it is two cold words, and no one steps forward in the first hours to tell you what it means, your mind will not sit patiently and wait. It will reach for something, anything, to fill the silence. And the internet that afternoon reached for some genuinely wild things. So before we come back to the honest, quieter truth of what this event really means, I think we owe it to ourselves to walk straight through the darker theories it spawned, to take them seriously enough to actually understand why they are wrong, and to see what they reveal about the real hunger underneath them. Let us go find out what people said was really happening off the coast of Florida. Part 11. What people said. It really was. The moment that screenshots started spreading, the theories bloomed, and I want to walk through them without a sneer, because the people reaching for them are not stupid. They are doing something deeply human. They are trying to make sense of a violent, unexplained event with a cryptic government label and no official voice telling them what it was. That is a reasonable situation in which to get suspicious. So let us take the biggest theories seriously, one at a time, and see exactly where each one meets the physics and breaks. The first and most popular was some version of a secret energy weapon. You've probably heard the name that gets invoked for this, a certain research program in Alaska that has become internet shorthand for weather control and earthquake weapons, along with the broader idea of directed energy weapons that can somehow reach out and shake the Earth from a distance. The theory, applied here, is that the government used some exotic technology to trigger a seismic event off Florida, and the experimental explosion label is a slip, a glimpse of the classified truth. It is a genuinely gripping idea, and it dies the instant you do the accounting. Because we already have a complete physics-closing explanation for every joule of energy in that signal, roughly 40,000 pounds of ordinary chemical high explosive detonated underwater, a technology as old as the 20th century. There is no unexplained energy left over that would require some exotic beam from the sky. When conventional explosives fully account for the observation, you do not need to invent a secret weapon to explain it. The blast explains itself. The second theory was the mirror image of the first, and in a way more interesting. Not that they used an energy weapon, but that they can now cause earthquakes, and this was a test of that capability. And here the irony is almost too perfect, because this event is close to the strongest possible evidence against the idea. Remember how we opened, with the seismologist able to tell an explosion from an earthquake by the fingerprint in the waves. This event was flagged as an explosion precisely because it did not look like fault slip. Its signature was a bang, not a tear. So far from being proof that someone triggered a quake, it is a vivid demonstration of how clearly our instruments can tell a man-made blast apart from real tectonic movement. If anything, the event proves the opposite of the theory it inspired. The machines were not fooled for a second, and neither should we be. The third theory was the fear that this was a secret detonation of something far larger and more sinister. A hidden military catastrophe. A weapon test gone wrong, something they did not want us to see. And this one deserves the most care, because it contains a grain of a true feeling wrapped around a false fact. The false fact is the secrecy. This was not hidden. It posted to a public feed in real time, under an accurate label, the way its 8 predecessors did across the decade. The activity behind it, ship shock trials, is openly documented by the Navy, with published rationales and released footage and federal environmental paperwork. There is no vault this crawled out of, but the grain of true feeling is worth honouring. It does feel like something is being kept from you, and in a narrow sense something is. Not the fact of the explosion, but the fuller context, the box, the program, the permitted harm, the name of the ship. Those were not concealed so much as never communicated. The theory mistakes a failure to explain for an active cover-up. The feeling is real. The conspiracy is not. Then there were the more exotic ideas, the ones that reach past the military entirely. Some suggested a natural cause the authorities were hiding, a sudden release of methane from the seabed, a great bubble of gas erupting from beneath the ocean floor. Others drifted toward the mythic, the waters off Florida sitting near the edge of the region, People romanticize as the Bermuda Triangle, and the imagination runs to sunken cities, to Atlantis, to something ancient stirring in the deep. I have a genuine soft spot for these because they come from a place of wonder rather than paranoia, and wonder is a good instinct even when it is pointed in the wrong direction. But the seismic signature does not support a natural gas blowout, which would look different in the waves, and it certainly does not require a lost civilization. The waveform matches a single, sharp, man-made explosion, the same as the 8 before it. The ocean is full of real mysteries worth being amazed by. This particular dot is simply not one of them. It is worth naming why this particular event was such perfect fuel, because it was almost engineered to be. Picture the exact combination a person met when they tapped that dot. A violent reading, magnitude 3.9, in a place with no business producing one. A depth of 0, which looks wrong to anyone who knows earthquakes happen underground. A location in open water, far from any town, with nothing obvious nearby to blame. And then that phrase, experimental explosion, which manages to sound clinical and ominous at once, official and withholding, as if it were admitting to an experiment while refusing to say what kind. If you set out deliberately to design a piece of information that would spawn conspiracy theories, you would struggle to do better than an unexplained zero-depth, open ocean explosion labelled as an experiment by a government agency. The theories were not a failure of the public. They were the predictable product of a near-perfect vacuum, and I want to defend for a second the impulse underneath even the wildest of them, because there is something healthy in it. A public that reflexively asks what the government is doing out there is, in many contexts, a public doing exactly what it should. Skepticism toward power is not a vice. The problem is never that people ask the question. The problem is that when the honest answer is slow or absent or buried in paperwork no one reads, the question gets answered by imagination instead of by fact. The cure for a bad theory is not to mock the people who reached for it. The cure is to make the true explanation arrive faster and louder than the false ones. On July 16th, it simply did not. Now, having taken all of those apart, I want to do something that I think is more honest than just declaring victory over the theories, because if I stop at debunking, I have missed the point. Ask yourself why these theories found such fertile ground. Why did an explanation as ordinary as a Navy shock trial get outrun, in those first hours, by energy weapons and hidden catastrophes in Atlantis? It is not because people are gullible. It is because the true explanation was not there when they needed it. The vacuum came first. The theories only rushed in to fill a space that the responsible institutions left empty for an afternoon. If the Geological Survey alert had carried one extra sentence, if a clear public voice had said in the first hour, "This was a scheduled Navy ship shock trial. Here is what that is," the theories would have had almost nothing to breathe. The conspiracy did not defeat the truth. The truth simply showed up late. And that tells you something important about the world we actually live in, something more useful than any single debunk. The danger, most of the time, is not that sinister forces are hiding enormous secrets from us. The danger is subtler and more ordinary, that genuinely important things happen in the open, correctly labelled, fully documented, and still fail to reach us, because no one whose job it is to translate the knowledge ever does. We are not mostly drowning in hidden conspiracies. We are drowning in unexplained disclosures, in facts that are technically public and functionally invisible, in a gap between what is known and what is communicated that our anxious minds will fill with monsters every single time it is left open. The real lesson of the theories is not that people are foolish. It is that silence, even innocent silence, breeds them. So we have now been all the way around this event. We know what the signal was and how we can tell. We know what went into the water and how much. We know the box and the season and the decade-long ledger of 9. We know what a blast like that does to the animals in its reach, and we know that the harm is not hidden, but permitted, counted, and signed. We know the same instruments that scared the public are the ones that guard against nuclear catastrophe, and we know why the theories came, and why they were wrong, and what their coming reveals. Which leaves only one question, the one I have been circling this entire time, the one the thumbnail promised. If it was not a secret weapon, and not a triggered quake, and not a hidden disaster, then what exactly is the thing that is actually wrong here? Because I do think something is. I just think it is the last thing you would expect, and it has been sitting in front of us the whole time. Part 12. the thing that is actually wrong. Here is what is actually wrong. Not a weapon, not a lie. Something quieter, and once you see it, much harder to unsee. What is wrong is that we have made the detonation of the ocean into a routine, and routine is the most powerful anesthetic there is. We have taken an act that, described plainly, sounds almost unbelievable, setting off 18 tons of high explosive in a living sea off a populated coast, an act that will kill and deafen animals within a radius of miles, an act repeated at least 9 times in a decade. And we have wrapped it in so much procedure, so much paperwork, so much correct and clinical language, that it has become as unremarkable as a permit renewal. The wrongness is not that it is hidden. The wrongness is that it is normal. And I want to be precise about what I mean, because it would be easy to hear this as a simple condemnation of the Navy, and that is not what I am doing. There are real reasons for shock trials. Sending sailors to sea in a ship that has never been tested against the shock of combat would be its own kind of moral failure, arguably a worse one. I am not standing here telling you these tests should never happen, because I genuinely do not know that they should not. What I am telling you is that the machinery we have built to make them acceptable, the box drawn on the water, the season chosen around the whales, the take authorizations that count the dead in advance, the observers scanning the sea, the clean 2-word label on the public feed, all of it works so well, so smoothly, that it has removed this from the realm of things we ever actually think about. The machine does not just permit the act, it digests it. It turns something extraordinary into something no one has to feel. That is the deeper meaning of the gap I've been pointing at all along, the gap between the known and the felt. Every piece of this is disclosed. The permits are public, the environmental reviews are public, the Navy's rationale is public, the seismic record is public. By every technical measure, this is one of the most transparent violent acts a government routinely performs. And yet it lands on the public consciousness as a mystery, once, for an afternoon, before sinking back out of view. The transparency is real, and the awareness is absent, and those two things coexisting is not an accident or a scandal. It is the designed outcome of a system optimized to make a hard thing frictionless. We did not hide the detonation of the sea. We did something more effective. We made it boring. Think about the animals in that light, because this is where it stops being abstract. Somewhere in that box on July 16th, the shockwave went out through the water and passed through bodies that had no permit, no warning, and no way to file an objection. Maybe the timing held, and the box was as empty of the vulnerable as the models hoped. Probably it largely was. But the entire arrangement rests on a bet placed by us that the convenience of a known test site and a known season outweighs the risk to creatures we have already pushed to the brink elsewhere. And the most honest thing I can say is that we do not really weigh that bet at all, because the machine weighs it for us, in advance, in units of authorized take, and then hands us back a clean number and a quiet ocean and a 2-word label, so that we never have to stand at the edge of the water and actually decide whether we are willing to pay it. The wrongness is the outsourcing of the decision. We have arranged never to have to choose, and so we never choose, and the choosing gets made anyway, every summer, by the machinery, in our name. And this, I think, is the real reason an event like this unsettles people, even after it is explained. Because on some level, below the conspiracy theories, people sense that the mystery was never really the point. When the true explanation arrives, a Navy shock trial, permitted, routine, the 9th of its kind, the feeling of wrongness does not fully dissolve the way it does when you solve an ordinary puzzle. It shifts. It moves from the explosion to the normalcy of the explosion. The energy weapon would almost have been easier to hold, because a villain is a simple thing. This is harder, because there is no villain, only a process, and the process is us, and it is working exactly as designed, and that is the unsettling part. The thing that is wrong is not that someone broke the rules. It is that the rules produced this, and we agreed to the rules, and then we looked away. So when you saw those 3 words on the thumbnail, something is wrong, I meant them, but not in the way you might have expected walking in. Something is wrong, but it is not out there in the dark water waiting to be exposed. It is in here, in the arrangement we have all quietly accepted, in the smoothness of a system that can detonate a sea on a calendar and provoke nothing louder than a day of confused screenshots. The scandal is the silence, and the silence is not imposed on us. We participate in it. We refresh the feed, We feel the jolt of fear, we get the explanation, we feel the relief, and we move on. And the ledger ticks from 9 toward 10, and almost nobody is left standing at the shoreline still asking the questions that matter. Which is exactly why I am not going to let us move on quite that easily. Because the story is not actually over. These trials come in series, remember. The ledger does not stop at 9 just because we have finished making sense of the 9th. There is, in all likelihood, more of this coming, maybe within days of the event that started this video, maybe already logged by the time you watch this, quietly, in the same box under the same label, waiting for the next person to stumble onto it and feel the same jolt of fear we have now spent this whole time understanding. So let us end not by closing the book, but by looking at what comes next, and at the one question still hanging out over that water that no amount of physics has been able to answer. Part 13, the next one. Watch the map. That is the strange, practical takeaway from all of this, and I mean it literally. If the pattern of the last decade holds, the July 16th event was very likely not a solitary blast, but one rung on a ladder, one detonation in a series that walks the charge closer to the ship over a span of weeks. The Jackson series was 3, the Ford series was 3. So there is a real chance that in the days and weeks around that event, the box off Florida shook again and again quietly, each one posting to the same feed under the same 2 words, each one a magnitude 3 point something that most people will never see. By the time you're watching this, the ledger may already have ticked past 9. The count is a living thing, and it is still counting, and that changes how you should read the earthquake map from now on, in a small but permanent way. The next time you see a dot off the southeastern coast of the United States labelled experimental explosion, at 0 depth, in the summer, you're not going to feel that first jolt of confused fear, because you will know. You will know it is almost certainly a warship being certified for combat, in a box drawn for exactly that purpose, on a schedule set partly around the whales, its harm counted and permitted in advance. You will have crossed the gap from the uninformed to the informed, and the same dot that reads as a mystery to everyone else will read to you as exactly what it is. That is the one gift this whole story can actually give you. Not the removal of the event, but the removal of your blindness to it. But I promised you a question that survives all the answers, and here it is, sharpened now by everything we have learned. Of all the pieces of this event, one never clicked into place. In 2016 we got the Jackson. In 2021 we got the Ford. But the ship being tested off Florida in the summer of 2026 did not clearly step forward into the light. The Navy confirmed the act. The vessel stayed in shadow. And a shock trial, remember, is the final exam a warship takes before it is trusted to carry human beings into a war. So the real unanswered question is not what shook the sea. We know what shook the sea. The question is what ship the United States was quietly making ready for battle in that water, and why, this one time, its name was the single fact we were not given. I do not have that name for you tonight, and I am not going to invent one, because inventing it would be exactly the kind of vacuum filling we spent this whole story learning to resist. But I will tell you why the missing name matters more than it might seem. A new ship being shock tested is a small, visible sign of a much larger and mostly invisible process, the constant preparation of a military for the conflicts it expects. Each of these blasts is a flake breaking off that process and surfacing where we can see it, on an earthquake map of all places. And the ship that goes unnamed is a reminder that even when we manage to understand one of these surfacings completely, to explain the explosion and the depth and the box and the season and the ledger and the paperwork and the whales, there is still a layer beneath it that does not surface at all. The part we can see is always the smaller part. So think about what it actually means that the loudest this ever gets is a dot on a map. We have built a world in which we can detonate the ocean on a calendar, kill and deafen the animals in its reach within a legally counted limit, rehearse our instruments against the sound of nuclear apocalypse, and prepare a nameless warship for a war we hope never comes. And the only trace of all of it that reaches the ordinary person is a small circle on a screen, labelled in 2 clinical words, gone from the feed by morning. The event is enormous. The signal we receive from it is almost nothing. And the distance between those 2 things, between how vast this really is and how small it looks from where we stand, is the true subject of everything we have talked about tonight. That is the ledger off the coast of Florida. 9 entries and counting, written in the language of earthquakes hidden in plain sight, Each one a moment where the ocean was made to shake by our own hand and then went quiet again before most of us even looked up. The instruments will keep listening. The box will keep its shape. The season will come around again next summer, and the one after that, and somewhere a new ship will sail out to take its shocks, and the seafloor will heave, and a dot will appear, and a handful of people will feel that old, correct, misaimed flicker of dread. And when that dot appears, the question worth carrying with you is not whether something is wrong. Something is. The question is the one that has been hanging over that water the entire time, unanswered, waiting for you to be the kind of person who still bothers to ask it. Whose ship was it? Where is it going? And what does it say about the world we're quietly preparing for, that we can rehearse for war in a living sea and call it, on the record, nothing more than an experiment?